Okay, hello everybody. My name is Eileen Donahoe, and Nico asked me to come speak to you about the United Nations, or the UN. And I guess my personal connection, let me start there, my personal connection to the United Nations, which I will tell you about, the entity itself, was that I was the U.S. ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva for 4 years, from 2010 through 2013. And I now work at a human rights organization called Human Rights Watch as the Director of Global Affairs, and we basically try to put pressure and scrutiny on the governments throughout the world to live up to their commitments that they've made through the UN system. So that's my connection. I want to talk a little bit about the connection between roots and the UN. And let me first ask, of the kids who are here in the audience, anybody, 15, 16 or younger, have you heard of the United Nations? Has anybody heard of the United Nations? Because I'd heard of one person who was actually 16-year-old and said, I think I've heard of the United Nations. So let me start by saying the United Nations has one important thing very much in common with Roots. Roots was founded with this idea that you're trying to make the world a better place and create a better world. And as I understand it, this whole project is to try to empower all of you to understand your power and responsibility to make the world a better place. And in many ways, that's what the UN was also founded for. And interestingly, the reason I decided to put this slide back up, which was something that Sci-Fi and Kryptina had up at the very top of the program, these are the actually this is it's the one before this. These are the rules, but you don't have to change the slide. I will tell you, I'm interested in the principles behind the founding. Yeah, those are the values. It's even before the rules. Values are last. I think it's the first. That's it. Okay. If you look at those 5 principles, the same principles apply at the UN. In fact, the United Nations was founded on the concept that the world is one. We're all connected. These connections are growing stronger and faster every day, and that has been true since the founding of the UN. Chaos controls the connections. Focus controls the chaos, and you control the focus. So I'm going to tell you how these things apply to the UN now. So the UN, United Nations, was founded 70 years ago, way before the internet existed. And it was founded in the aftermath of World War II, where over 60 countries around the world had been engaged in a multiple-year war that covered much of the globe. Millions of people were killed, and much of the planet experienced physical devastation. And that devastation was enough to get the leaders of the world to say, okay, this is not acceptable. We've got to figure out a way to solve problems without going to war. So the original idea was that each government in the world would come together at the United Nations, they would send a representative, and that those representatives of their governments would sit down and solve problems without, fighting in a physical military way. Today, there are 193 governments that are part of the UN. And the original organization of the UN had 3 parts. One part was the protection of international peace and security, basically preventing war. Second part was economic development and alleviating poverty, because everybody understood poverty was a big driver of conflict. Third part, this is the part I really care about, is the protection of human rights. And the idea that individual people, by virtue of being a human being, have certain inalienable rights. The rights don't come because the government gave you the rights, you've got them. Government's job is to protect and promote the freedoms and rights of their own citizens. So those were the founding ideas. The other very interesting piece of this is that at the time, there was this understanding that governments controlled physical territory, and that each government was responsible for the security inside the geographic physical boundaries of that territory, and they were responsible to the people within that territory, citizens. So what happened? The internet came and has completely disrupted this entire system in certain very challenging ways. Because the internet doesn't really recognize geographical boundaries as particularly important. You can communicate with people anywhere on the planet, and governments don't really control that ability necessarily. Part of what's happened is that a lot of power has been distributed from governments to private sector technology companies, as well as to individuals. Hackers are incredibly empowered vis-a-vis all kinds of entities in the world, in particular, other governments. And there's this sort of new power dynamic. There's what we call asymmetry. It used to be you'd have one government against another government or multiple governments fighting against each other. But at least you sort of knew who your enemies were and what their abilities were, and you knew how to think about protection and when you'd make a deal. Currently, governments are so much more vulnerable because individual hackers or people anywhere can disrupt their societies and cause massive damage. So this is kind of where Roots comes in. And I want to connect what you guys are all doing with the 3 big projects that the U.S. was formed for. So let's just start with that first one, international peace and security. People being trained here could play an amazing role in helping governments, as well as private sector entities, as well as individual citizens around the globe, to protect themselves in terms of their digital security, and in particular, protection of critical infrastructure. Because now the concept of war, what everybody's focused on now, and the biggest threat everybody's worried about, is cyber warfare. And what's really challenging about cyber warfare is it's difficult. It's called an attribution problem. It's difficult to know who your attacker is. And so the importance of protection of your critical infrastructure becomes so important, because you can't necessarily deter the bad actors with your own physical overwhelming power as you could have in the previous age. You can be attacked from anywhere, and it's difficult to know even who to go after. So cybersecurity for critical infrastructure is something you all could be working on. The second big pillar of the UN is the one about economic development. I want you to think about this. There are 7 billion people in the world. Of those 7 billion, 4 billion, more than half, do not have connection to the internet. They do not have access to information communication technology, digital technology, and therefore all of the resources and information that you experience in your life because of those connections are completely lacking. So just try to imagine, what would it be like to live if you didn't have access to digital technology and the internet? So that's the second big bucket where you could put your skills to work, if it is enhancing or exponentially expanding the access to information communication technology. That's the second big UN project you could really help with. The third one that I really care about is the protection and promotion of human rights. And here, the internet has, in some ways, been an incredible boon to the exercise of human rights. In effect, the internet has become the landscape on which people actually exercise all their freedoms. Freedom to access information, freedom to share information, freedom to communicate what they think, form their opinions, share their opinions, and communicate with people around the world. It's also the means by which people organize themselves for any kind of project that they're engaged in for social good. It's done via the internet, and that's called freedom of assembly and association. So access to information, ability to communicate, that's freedom of expression, fundamental right. Freedom of assembly and association, how you organize yourselves, is done essentially on the internet at this point. And it's done globally. People can connect with each other all over the world. So that's the upside. The downside of the internet or digital technology and information communication technology is that it's also empowered governments in certain ways that completely undermine human rights. So on the one hand, you can have repressive governments that basically monitor and track everything their citizens do. And I can tell you that if you knew that everything you were doing at every minute, as Nico said, cameras in your hotel room, everywhere you went by your government, it would obviously have a massively, what we say, chilling effect on your exercise of your freedom. You'd be less likely to say what you think out loud. You'd be less likely to meet with people who you thought you might put at risk. You're just constrained by virtue of not having that privacy. It has enhanced the ability to do mass surveillance of everybody with the digitization of everything. So what I would say is that the part of human rights protection and promotion that you all could really help with is digital security for individuals and helping governments understand that the way they actually protect their national security is by understanding the digital security of all of their citizens as individuals, the digital security of everybody's data, their health data, their banking records, their search records, all of it is an aspect of security that is not antithetical or against national security. It's actually the means through which you achieve your national security. The other thing, you all work in this space and you're enhancing digital security, you've got to advocate for the importance of that digital security to your governments. The other big piece of it is just plain advancing the idea that privacy itself is a right. It's a human right. It's an international, universal human right that every individual should have. And in many places, in many government conversations, it's not well understood and it's not valued adequately. But the basic idea is that you cannot exercise any of your other rights, your other fundamental freedoms. Freedom to form opinions, to collect information, to share your opinions, to express yourself, to have meetings, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly and association. None of those things are really possible or fully possible if you have no zone of privacy. Because as I said, if everything you do is being tracked and monitored and watched, you're not going to feel empowered to exercise your rights to do what you would otherwise do. And I believe your generation and all of you in this program are so far ahead of the curve in understanding the value of privacy. And part of your job is not just on the technical dimension, it's as advocates out in the world for the importance of privacy to all of your freedom. And by the way, to your security, to the security of your country, to national security, to international peace and security. We've got to start with the protection of privacy. So let me stop there. Those are the basics about the UN and how closely it relates to the work that all of you are doing. And there's a space for you to help with in the international peace and security, cyber, protecting critical infrastructure with cybersecurity, helping connect the world to the internet, but most importantly, advocating for privacy as the core, the essential piece of being able to exercise human rights anywhere. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. Anybody want to ask anything? Okay, that's it.